LGBTQIA+, the legislature and the light of the world. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about identity. In fact, I have several articles coming on this topic, so check back over the coming weeks. My main thesis will be that identity is given to us rather than discovered for ourselves. One of the greatest harms that we have done to society is to detach ourselves from the sense of inherited identity. Who we are is formed by our place within society, our connection to our family, and our God-given roles as a man, woman, child, father, or mother. To be sure, our identity is complex, but at its core, it is assumed rather than self-determined. It is like a suit that has been tailored for us rather than a unisex, one-size-fits-all t-shirt. Because of this, true security comes when we take our cues for who we are from truthful and valid exterior reference points. And from this point, we can become confident in our identity as we shoulder the good and honorable responsibilities and skills that attend those roles. This is why there has recently been such a ruckus down in the Sunshine State. The Florida State Legislature recently passed several bills that recognize that parents, not schools, have the right and responsibility to oversee what their children are being taught and told. On top of this, the so-called Don't Say Gay bill prevents schools and teachers from encouraging, quote, classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade levels, end quote. On the one hand, we can observe the reaction from progressives with a certain dark humor. Indeed, many memes have been made about this and specifically about the absolutely embarrassing response that progressives have given. On the other hand, though, their reaction horrifies me. Many of us ask why people are reacting so strongly to good, noble legislation. In order to understand this, we need to understand the relationship between sin and God's prerogative to assign us our identities. You see, while it is true that our culture is committing many great evils, at the core of all of them is the fact that we have rejected our identity as creatures who are accountable to the God who made us. Quote, for although they knew God, they did not honor God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Romans 1:21, end quote. Here we see that the first step in all rebellion against God is to reject two simple facts about him. First, we reject the fealty that we owe him as our creator. And second, we reject the fact that we depend on him for all things. And in this way, we determine that we will worship every other thing besides God. In short, we reject our identity as dependent creatures. This is at the heart of the discussion going on about the Florida bills. When we look at the bills, much has been made about the fact that they are designed to give power and responsibility back to parents. This is good and proper, and we ought to reinforce this God-given primary role in as many ways as we can throughout society. I thank God for this major statement that Florida has made about parents' primacy in raising children. In addition, many, such as Matt Walsh, have spoken more broadly about the assault that the left wages against our children by pushing a demonic gender ideology down their throat before they can even swallow mashed bananas. Award-winning books and television shows have been produced to pollute our children's perceptions before they are old enough to know what is right and that what they are being told is wrong and offensive. Matt Walsh is right to fight this battle on the basis that calling men women and women men is a lie and a way of rejecting reality. The trans movement simultaneously breaks the rules of biology, grammar, reproduction, and intimacy all at once. But there is more to consider. This past week, I came across a video of several people objecting to the idea that the schools should not teach LGBTQIA+ ideas to children. One of the men in this video was upset and pointed out that if we teach children about mothers and fathers, but not about fathers and fathers, we essentially communicate to children that the mother-father relationship is good and normal, while the so-called father-father relationship is abnormal and twisted. And he is absolutely correct. This is exactly what it teaches children. And this truth is the primary reason why Christians must actively fight against all attempts to allow children to be programmed into believing that any of the LGBTQIA plus nonsense is normal, acceptable, or good. Our message is that God has outlawed all forms of behavior and expression within that ever-expanding waterfall of rainbow and pastel-colored letters. So, when we think about why it is good that the government of Florida passed the bills that it did, we must resist the urge to say that our objection to indoctrinating children with perverse ideologies about sexuality and gender is simply an issue of grammar. Of course, in one sense, it is an issue of grammar, but it is also much more. We cannot say that these bills are exclusively about parental rights, that we must defend the sphere and sovereignty of the family. So while I applaud every hill that we take in this battle, I fear that even in this victory, we might fall into cowardice. I fear that some of us might try to hide behind a soft message that is somewhat palatable to culture. We might be tempted to say something like, we don't want to say that trans ideology is an evil, destructive movement that all citizens and government officials ought to reject. Rather, we say, we just want to make sure that parents have a bigger say in what their children are taught. And if we are not careful, we will fall into the trap of saying squishy half-truths in order to avoid offending people with complete truth. This kind of deceit is cowardly, and it is the devil's tool. We criticize pagans who use these tactics to deceive people into ungodliness. Examples include slogans such as marriage equality, pro-choice, and cradle to birth. We must not stoop to this deceit. We must speak with clarity about reality as God defines it. Then we must call on the government to, quote, punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. 1 Peter 2, 13 through 14, end quote. At this point, it's helpful to consider an insight that I learned from Andrew Klavan. He points out that our battle is not simply for propositional truth, that is, that reality exists as God actually defines it. While we must indeed fight that battle, on top of that, we must remind people that all of us are morally accountable to submit to reality as God has decreed it. We must submit to the identity that He has given to us, in the same way that He put boundaries around the planet's orbits and constrains them by the force that we call gravity. God has put boundaries around all emotional, sexual, and identity-related reality. And as the planets are obligated to move along the path that God has made for them, so we are morally obligated to live within the boundaries of reality as God has created it. This is, in fact, the definition of sin. The Sunday school definition of sin is that sin is a failure to hit the mark. That is, we are morally accountable to live within the reality of how God created humans to live. There is no wiggle room here, no blurred lines or coloring outside the edges. We are not kindergartners trying to learn to hold our crayons. We are accountable people. Think, for instance, about anger. Humans are created to express anger at the proper things, but not to lose their tempers when they are in traffic. The fact that we all lose our tempers and express anger at the wrong things does not change the fact that God has created us to live self-controlled, patient lives. When we sin in anger, we reject the reality of how a person is supposed to live. We leave the God-given boundary of what permissible anger is. And this is sin. Sin is not immoral because the deeds are inherently immoral. After all, anger, and even killing are right in certain situations. Sin is immoral because it rejects the boundaries that God has placed around us. It twists the definition of what God has said it means to be human and of how humans are supposed to live. Therefore, when we tell children that they can be whatever gender they want to be, we have not simply allowed them to color outside the line a little bit. We have thrown them out of the coloring book altogether. In short, we have told them, you are not accountable to God's definition of what it means to be a human. You are free to choose your own identity. Because God created us, He has the right to define us and give us our identity. After all, He is the potter, and we are the clay, Jeremiah 18:6. This means that a healthy society has an obligation to recognize reality as God has created it, and to reinforce that reality across many levels. God has called all governments, not just the Florida Legislature, to insist that we live in submission to God's definitions. Governments are God's servants for good as God defines it, Romans 13:4. So to be very clear, I welcome what Florida has done to give parents their rights back and to protect children at an early age. But it's also true that I want to stop normalizing homosexuality and transgenderism altogether. I want the law of the state to condemn and remove any curriculum that normalizes any sinful practice. I want the curriculum to advocate for God's standards of sexuality and gender. This is the truly loving path to take. Some of you will object by claiming that I am trying to enforce my morality on others. This is patently not true. I do not want to force my morality on others. I want to force God's morality on others. There, I said it. God has spoken clearly about these issues, and we can know what he said. This is also God's goal, by the way. If you doubt me, look at the 10 Commandments, where God commanded his people to require the sojourner who did not follow God to obey God. Quote, "But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates." Exodus 20:10, end quote. It's time for Christians to stop acting like it is wrong to insist that unbelievers obey what God has said. Yes, of course I know that this won't save them. Only the gospel will do that. But how will they know the goodness of the gospel if we don't tell them what God thinks of their rebellion? On top of that, the law of God is given to restrain evil within a society, and we desperately need evil to be restrained. There is nothing new under the sun, but there are new iterations of evil, and our generation has plumbed new depths of the rebellion against God's creation of man and woman. God will respond with greater judgment. But there's another point to consider here. God actually is pleased when a culture seeks to submit itself to his law, even if all the people within that culture do not individually fear and love God. God prospered the land of Egypt under Joseph's influence, and when the sin of nations descends to a certain depth of depravity, it is only then that God's wrath is kindled against them. Christian, do not allow yourself to be tied into knots over this. God's law is not hateful. It is loving. God's law is not oppressive. It is the law of liberty. James 1:25 and 2:12. God's law is not old-fashioned. It is eternal. And at the final judgment, every knee will bow in submission to King Jesus and his law. Our only two options are Christ or chaos. There will be many political conservatives who will chafe at this. After all, Fox News just hired Caitlyn Jenner as a major consultant, and many conservatives and even Christians extended warm congratulations to Dave Rubin when he announced that he and his so-called husband will have a child together through surrogacy soon. But no, we are not simply trying to preach what God says about fiscal conservatism or woke ideology. We must speak all of God's truth to those inside our camp as well as to those outside it. Otherwise, we discover that we are not actually calling for total submission to God's will, but rather a more acceptable friendship with the world. So it's time for brass tacks, rubber meeting hot asphalt, and putting our money where our mouth is, whatever that means. Christians must resist the trans movement on all fronts. Not only must they resist the invasion into schools, children's books, and television shows, but they must beat off the invaders and drive them from the walls of the castle, back out across the battlefield, and into perpetual and ignominious defeat. Please note, though, that we must first offer every rebel combatant the chance to throw down his or her arms, repent of fomenting and carrying out a rebellion against God's good order, and surrender to God's law. Once we have made that offer, however, we must, for the love of God, resist the evil forces that are destroying souls and society. I find it incredibly sad that the term that the people who support the LGBTQIA plus agenda have chosen for themselves is allies. Individual Christians, whole churches, and entire denominations have adopted this moniker. And yet here also, they have redefined a term that God had already defined for us. God calls this posture friendship with the world. And friendship with the world is enmity to God, James 4:4. Please hear me clearly. When I issue my call to arms and my plea that Christians do battle against the trans ideology, remember that our battle is not actually against the individuals who have been shackled by the LGBTQIA plus lies. After all, Paul reminds us that, quote, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, Ephesians 6:12, end quote. But our battle in the heavenly places does take place as we speak and act and pray here on this earth. We are body and spirit, not spirit only. We're destroying arguments and lofty speculations, but we are also called to minister to people. After all, Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 5:9-10, quote, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world, end quote. Please note that associating is not the same as approving. It is not the same as condoning. It is not the same as joining in their rebellion and agreeing with them that God has not said what he has clearly said. Rather, to love people who are caught in the LGBTQIA plus tornado means to utterly destroy the arguments that support this ideology. And it also means that we must sacrificially give these individuals our time and emotional energy when they realize that they need Jesus. There are, and will increasingly be many, who realize that when they decided to cut themselves and take hormone blockers, they have permanently damaged themselves. When this rebellion runs its course and when, like the prodigal son, God brings some of them to their senses, they will long to repent and return to the Father. And when they do, we must meet them, welcome them, weep with them, and bring them into our spiritual family as a proper brother or sister. The prodigal son was restored with a long bath, new clothes, and several healthy meals. It will not be so easy with some who have bought the sinister lie and have altered their bodies' physiology, chemistry, and even emotional makeup. We must love them when they repent. We must be ready to welcome them and help them regain what they can of biblical maleness and femaleness. In the same way that I'm asking you to steel your resolve to love people now by speaking truth to them, I'm also calling you to resolve to love those who respond to our message in the future. Sin utterly destroys all of us, and yet, when it comes to those who repent of their false LGBTQIA plus identities, you will be tempted to pull back from them. In God's providence, they depict how sin truly destroys all of us, and because of the physical and visceral display of sin's destruction, we will be tempted to pull away. We must resolve not to do this, no matter how they have harmed themselves. But our message cannot limit itself to some future mercy. We must act with present courage. We don't have to let society continue down this path. We should try to divert it by preaching the gospel as we push for righteous laws. Why would we not try to prevent the tragedies of bodies that can no longer align with the sex that God gave people? Why not push to make all trans-affirming hormone blockers illegal? Why not push to make gender reassignment surgery illegal and not funded by taxes? Why not speak the truth now, even if it risks offending someone? If this is not part of what it means to be salt and light, then I don't know what it means. Take courage, church, and understand the times in which we live. On Sunday, our pastor reminded us of this quote, "It is better to stand with God against the entire world than to stand with the entire world against God," end quote. Here's to a church that believes this idea, so that we do not have to stand alone against a pagan society, but rather shoulder to shoulder with brothers and sisters who do not fear the rainbow jihad, but who fear God instead.